Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be tuning in from. It's another edition of Veeam LinkedIn Live Industry Insights. Jason Buffington and I are joined by a special guest, Gaurav Rishi from Kasten, who is really now part of the Veeam family. So welcome, Gaurav. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Jason. This is fantastic. Happy to be here. Thrilled, actually.
Awesome. So a little housekeeping before we jump in. We're going to talk about containers today, and from a variety of perspectives, a little bit of a historical context, a little bit of, I'll call it, making sure we're all on the same page. That's the reason we've got Gaurav here, who's head of product at Kasten, knows this space actually about 100 times better than Jason and I combined. So we wanted to tap into his rich brain power. But I do want to just point out a couple of quick things. If you're new to this live stream or haven't seen it in a little while, we like to see where you're from, where you're tuning in from. So we do have a neat technology, a world map. If you could just place in the comments in LinkedIn where you're tuning in from, hi from either your country, your city, we'll figure it out. We'll refer to this, a couple times in the next roughly 25, 28 minutes, and just see how much of the globe we might be able to light up green. So don't be surprised if we come back to that. Now, I should also mention the comments in there are also for you to ask questions if you would like. We do have a team that's monitoring that and can forward to us a question or comment if you would like to make one. So with that, Jason, I actually want to pull you in and let's just talk a little bit about history. I'm a big believer that history repeats itself. I'm also a big believer that best practices oftentimes transcend technologies, transcends time. So we see them repeating as well, or holding consistent. But as we tee up the notion of containers, let's just roll back the clock a little bit. Maybe take us through a little discussion of the recent past.
Yeah, so, and we say recent past, let's roll the clock back about 12, 14 years. And the dominant backup players of the day were all backing up data centers that were predominantly physical, right? VMware was just coming into its own 14, 15 years ago. And Veeam had to sit down with the general population and say, please do not try to back up VMs the same way that you back up physical servers. Right? Because the way that physical servers had a whole lot of headroom and CPU and IO. And so you could hit them during a backup and it'd be okay. You do that with VMs and it would bring down that entire virtualized infrastructure. We said, no, you got to do it from underneath. You got to do it from the hypervisor. You got to treat the VM as an object and then go from there. And eerily enough, if you look at some of the early attempts to do containers, and Gaurav's probably got lots of horror stories on this one, people said, oh, no. If you can put it on VMware, we'll just back it up from there. Or you can back up the physical metal and it'll be fine. We'll figure it out later. That is not the way that you back up containers. And so history does repeat itself when the dominant players of the day say, no, just keep doing what you're doing and keep buying our stuff and we'll figure it out on the backside. And so now here we are 14, 15 years later to help people understand, do not back up containers the way that you backed up the data centers of yesteryear. And that's why we got a rock star with us joining today.
Wow.
Yeah, and Gaurav, I think this is a good time to, segue into exactly what Jason mentioned, which is it's pretty common for the industry powers that be to say, hey, there's something new. So what all you need to do is just flex in what you've been doing in the past into a slightly different environment, and that will be enough. Now, I'm not making light of that. In some situations, that can be appropriate or can be appropriate for a period of time. And then innovations, change, come to market. We also have expertise and learning that takes place. But Jason teed up very nicely the notion of a VM and Kubernetes or containers. You've got a very nice slide to walk us through to give us a little bit of an education about that.
Yeah, no, thanks, Dave. I mean, I completely agree. If it doesn't repeat, history definitely rhymes. And I think Jason has a fantastic blog which actually talks about some of these discontinuities. And I know we've talked about this in the past, but there has been, this is a seminal moment in terms of a discontinuity which ends up happening, I want to say, every 10 to 12 years, like you said. And so the rise of Kubernetes and containers is one of those events, which is rare, but it also requires us to sort of take a step back and look at why we need to think about this holistically and why we need to sort of not force fit something in. So, if you kind of look at that slide, which I know you had alluded to, I'll try and demystify it a little bit, right, to say why things are different now, and hopefully that makes sense to folks because Kubernetes is new. I like to say there are people who believe Kubernetes is 6 years old, but then I think for a majority of us, Kubernetes is still 6 years new in that context, that it's a new ecosystem and a lot of things are changing. So there are two sort of buckets if you had to think about why and what Kubernetes brings to the table. So first of all, the way applications are being developed is very different. You have applications which are being broken up from monoliths to becoming microservices. What that does is once you have microservices and that's under the covers, smaller databases, we use the word polyglot persistence, and I'll get into some of that a little later, where each application might use multiple databases under the covers. It's now not that the entire application sits on one server or one particular virtual machine. These microservices are distributed across multiple VMs and multiple servers by the Kubernetes layer. I almost think of Kubernetes as the next generation distributed operating system, if I had to simplify this to the core. And so you have no visibility with an older tool to figure out even where your application is because it's not in one place. It's dynamically being scheduled into different types of servers and VMs, and they come in and they go out. So right from having the visibility to having this dynamism is something which is completely new. I think also what ends up happening is as soon as you break up an application into multiple microservices, you suddenly have a state explosion. So you now have not just one application, not only do you have multiple microservices, Kubernetes itself stores a lot of its configuration related information in what are called Kubernetes objects. So this would be things like, hey, look, I need to have secrets or configuration data that my application needs to get started. How many replicas of a database should I have? All of this information is stored in things like config maps, and I don't want to get and throw sort of Kubernetes terminology here, but the broader point I want to make is the number of objects that you need to now store is actually manyfold than what older tools need to store. So that itself brings another discontinuity. And then also, I think if you think about it, you need to be Kubernetes native as opposed to staying outside the system. And the reason you want to do that is, I know we always talk about backup being your last line of defense, but a backup application itself has to be itself secure. And so to get that level of security in a Kubernetes environment, you need to sort of go ahead and make sure you understand that. And so Kubernetes provides contexts like namespaces, which go and create a little bit of circle around where your application components and microservices reside. And you can't be sitting outside of Kubernetes and trying to go ahead and protect these applications if you don't even understand those constructs. So that's one bucket, which is the infrastructure and the way applications are built. And that sort of is something where I tried to explain a little bit. The other big change, which is really happening hand in hand with all of this, is the rise of DevOps. This is from an operator's perspective. And I think one thing to point out is IT organizations themselves are becoming IT ops organization. In fact, it's quite common for us to see titles like cloud ops or at times engineering leads because development folks are looking to go ahead and say, look, I want to be able to not only develop my applications, I'm also going ahead and thinking about infrastructure as code. And that's something that is built in. And when I was alluding to things like the number of replicas that you might use in your microservice, that is something that the IT ops team now needs to surface very quickly so that the development team can very easily go ahead and support and bake that in. They don't have the patience to wait for a few weeks to go ahead and get the right storage class or get the right type of data service. So what that means is now as a data management tool, which means things like providing backup and recovery and so on, you need to have the capabilities of being able to provide self-service portals to these apps teams. And these, again, are something where they need to be app oriented. So they need to understand what an application is, what the underlying components is. And this is very different from being infrastructure or VM oriented, which is what life used to be like because of all the points I made earlier. And then maybe finally, I'll just make one more sub point under that rise of DevOps. There is a new ecosystem which Kubernetes and the cloud native ecosystem has brought in. I'm not sure my t-shirt can be seen, but this is from the last KubeCon, which I attended physically. And it is fascinating to see that there are more than 500 companies who are part of this cloud native ecosystem, which do everything from monitoring to new types of storage systems. And so you have to live in this new ecosystem world and integrate with Prometheus for monitoring, etc. You don't want to be trying to force fit two different wavelengths or an impedance mismatch if you're an electrical engineering student that this slide calls out. And I think that's the other reason. So let me pause there. A lot of information here, but hopefully between those two buckets of the new way of developing applications and how they spread out, as well as the new way of operations, which is DevOps, you get a sense of why there is a discontinuity.
Right. Well, speaking of history lessons, Gaurav, humble brag that you attended a conference with humans and other people in attendance there. That's
right.
A bit of a distant memory that we'll look forward to at some point in the future. But also, in all seriousness, speaking of, world, let's go back to the map. I'm told we might have something like a dozen more countries since we last peeked in and 5 more states.
All right.
South America, Africa, Middle East, India. We've got parts of Europe, Canada. So thank you very much for that. Do please keep commenting on where you might be viewing us from. We'll probably take at least one more look at that as we go along. And quick shout out, if you do have a question, we're very fortunate to have Gaurav with us, and so we can be able to try to get to that in real time if possible. So feel free to link that in. So let's put a finer point on some of these sort of changing realities, Gaurav, because you mentioned a bit of changing technology, but also changing roles. Jason and I are kind of longtime backup nerds, and let's think about data protection and containers, more specifically. Maybe take us through a little of that.
Sure. So I know we had another slide for that. So if you kind of, flash that out, the way, we think about data protection, like you said, and mobility, we think about 3 sort of key use cases. And backup and recovery is bread and butter. I think all of us are familiar with that. I think disaster recovery has also always been there because you want to make sure that you are taking care of not protecting all your assets in a single location, because who knows when disaster strikes, and that's how typically it was defined. And I'll talk about how lines are blurring, but the middle part, which is application mobility, is a very important one also, and that is an overloaded term, so I'll try and demystify that also. But with these 3 use cases, what you need to keep in mind is how does what I talked about make a difference for enabling these 3 use cases. So one is, first of all, the reality is there are a lot of applications which are on premises, and then there are a lot of new born in the cloud applications which are available in just the public clouds, for example. But majority of it is essentially people using multiple clouds and or a hybrid environment where you have something on premises and something in the cloud. There could be multiple reasons for it. It could be because you have certain data governance laws where data can't reside somewhere. It could be pure economics. It could be optionality. But for any stat that you read, you'll see that this is the reality where you're going to have, for cloud native applications, a distributed environment in terms of how you deploy it, and that's going to stay. The second point, which I was alluding to even earlier, is polyglot persistence, which is just a fancier way of saying that when you look at a new cloud native application, it breaks up into microservices. And microservices, developers end up using both SQL and NoSQL modern databases to do the job at hand with the best possible tools. So they might, for example, use PostgreSQL or they might use MySQL when they're developing their particular microservice. In the NoSQL database, it's an embarrassment of riches, actually. It's everything from key value stores like Redis, or it could be document stores like MongoDB. It could be white column stores like Cassandra. And you end up having a lot of these databases used by a single application under the covers. And you need to make sure that you're protecting all of those. And then finally, I touched on this also from an operations perspective, where now your IT ops teams need to enable a self-service portal which supports role-based access control. So teams can come in and say, look, I want to be able to secure my application. So you're not talking about infrastructure-centric backup anymore. We are talking in terms of my entire application, which in turn could be anywhere. So that's where app mobility comes into play. It could be across clouds, or it could be between regions inside a cloud, or even if you have a particular data center, it could be between clusters. So it could be Kubernetes cluster in a simple single region that you might have in your own private data center. So to be able to back up and move these applications composed of all of these microservices, keeping the application as the unit of atomicity is something that you need to make sure you support and you enable by these self-service tools. Also, I think I mentioned that Kubernetes is sort of 6 years new. What I also didn't mention, though, is that Kubernetes versions come out 3 or 4 a year. So it is very common for people to be able to have a requirement where they started off on, let's say, version 1.17 of Kubernetes, and now you have version 1.19. So you want to have the application mobility to be able to have taken a backup in 1.17, but when you restore, you want to be restored in whatever is the latest one, which is version 1.19, which itself brings up new requirements, but your data protection tools also need to support that. So hopefully that gives a little bit of depth in terms of not only do you need to support the 3 use cases that I guess all of us are familiar with from the past, but now the 3 new sort of buckets of considerations that I talked about, which make the task slightly different. And that's why you need to take a Kubernetes-native approach.
So this is where, Jason and I feel very comfortable or familiar, I'll say, above the line of what you showed. Jason, you've got a great saying that, basically, what is it? Migration is the disaster that you plan for. So some of the DR discussion, mobility discussion that Gaurav mentioned, that's certainly something that we're used to in the historical constructs of what we're trying to protect.
Yeah, I think about it as, and I think the way Gaurav said it originally when he opened up that last slide was perfect. He said, certainly it's about backup, right? And then DR has always been an extension of that backup conversation. And only after you have, and I'm putting a little bit of parentheses on this part, only after you have solved backup, right, and made that data reinstantiatable upon request, whether that's for reactive backups or for disaster recoveries, then you start to get into some interesting enablement scenarios like mobility, which kind of sounds like the talk track that we've been having here at Veeam for the last several years, right? The other thing, though, especially for those of us who have been watching this podcast for a while, a lot of the concepts that Gaurav shared, if you're not into containers, you're like, wow, that is so different than how I'm used to thinking about backup. And if you roll the clock back 15 years and you try to describe to somebody what a hypervisor was, you'd have a lot of those same kind of glazed over eyes along the way. So Dave, do you want to go through the map first? Let's see where we are and then kind of pivot to, now that we've expanded on how complex the problem is, let's talk about some of the solution outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's take a quick look at the world map here. I think we've got a few more intro. Oh my gosh. Okay, so we've got Russia in particular shows up. We've got actually more of Africa as well. So thank you so much for that. Looks like a little bit more of Europe. So always amazing representation, Gaurav. We're always so pleasantly surprised and thrilled. Now some, I guess, what's it been, Jason? 3-4 months we've been doing this. Maybe it's closer to 4.
6.
6 time flies.
This is I think this is episode 24, which means, and at 1 a week. We've been doing this for 6 months, every Monday. So
that's awesome. So yeah, thank you everyone for that. We've got Italy and Russia, Czech Republic, Germany, I think South Africa, if we haven't mentioned before, another state, I believe Idaho came in there. So let's double click a little bit. I like this next slide. We'll just touch on it briefly. But on slide here on K10, meaning the Kasten platform, I feel like there's a lot of similarities. I know Jason and I, when we talk about this, see this one, we recognize some heritage here, but maybe Gaurav, take us through it, just a little bit of this.
Sure. No, thank you. And I think just on the comment of the map, I was like, wow, that's a big travel list. I'm still looking forward to whenever we can start traveling. This is so interesting. But on Kasten K10, and there's a little bit of wordplay, Kubernetes people actually abbreviated and call it K8. When Kasten, which is German for containers, started, we also said, look, let's call our core product K10, because not only are we Kubernetes native, we sit on top of Kubernetes distributions. And so that was how K10 came in, and also the zero looks like a container. So anyway, multiple things going on. But the key point to make out here is K10 is a software platform. It installs in less than 10 minutes in your Kubernetes cluster. So, this is something where you might be running on a public cloud, you might be running in a private data center. You could be using various types of Kubernetes distributions, whether it's OpenShift or Azure AKS. And what K10 does is it just gets installed in there, and within a matter of a few minutes, it'll automatically discover all of those applications I was talking about, including creating a dependency map of the underlying microservices, the data services that those microservices might be using, the persistent volumes, which is the underlying storage systems that it's using. And it then can go ahead and ask you to set up policies, which is an easy way to say, I want these things to be backed up. I want them to be backed up and put for disaster recovery reasons in this particular object store. And stay tuned for some very interesting announcements tomorrow at Veeam Live around extensions to that. And we make this so easy to use because we do realize that Kubernetes is new. And so we want to make sure that we are meeting customers where they are, as opposed to where we want them to be. So we do want to be that bridge to help you with that, and that's why we have this very, very easy to use user interface. But let it not fool you, because we also have actually very rich Kubernetes native APIs, which people can go ahead and put in terms of their own automation tool frameworks. So we've got people who start off with a user interface, but then very quickly automate it completely with Prometheus and PagerDuty locked into it to go ahead and have everything done. And then, of course, we've touched on security a couple of times. This is extremely secure, where not only is all the content that we keep in your premises encrypted, even when we are moving it out to object stores, etc., it's completely encrypted. And then we ourselves, like I said, do support Kubernetes native APIs in terms of cluster role bindings and so on to get you that RBAC. So even when you have a self-service portal, you get to see the policies and the applications, only the ones which your Kubernetes administrator has authorized you to see. So it's also extremely important in this new world to make sure that these RBAC and self-service portals are giving you the right window in terms of what you see and what you can do on those objects or applications. So that's maybe a very high-level view of Kasten K10. But like I said, we do want to make sure backup is as easy as 1, 2, 3. And indeed, that's been the case and the feedback from our customers.
Easy as 1, 2, 3, easy to use. Where have I heard that phrase on easy to use before? Look, and we've said this about Veeam's competitors. I'm sure Kasten says this about the folks that they're trying to, or that people are trying to catch up with them on. Easy is hard to design. Right? If you want complex, go look at any of Veeam's competitors. I mean, you can get complex if you want it, but actually going through the effort of not only the engineering, but also the aesthetics of how do you get rid of the complexity of the platform so that you can just focus on the outcomes, right? That is important, and that is rare. And it just so happens that both the companies on this call have been really committed to that from the very beginning. But yeah, ease of use, to get rid of the complexity of containers, to get rid of hypervisors and the commoditized storage that goes into that, and all that other complexity, that's hard to do, right? It's why Veeam is where it is today. It's why Kasten is the crown jewel when it comes to containers as a discussion point. So yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, we do have a question that came in from Rajendra. So could you briefly explain the Veeam architecture design specific to containerized workloads? And the short answer is literally in about 24 hours or less, We're going to make some discussion announcements, on that front at Veeam Live tomorrow. So I don't want to steal thunder from. We're going to have a joint presentation from someone from Kasten and someone on the product strategy team from Veeam. Short story or a little bit of a commercial. Gaurav, it's not a stretch to say that there's been work and integration taking place for some time. The acquisition closed recently. The integration work did not start recently.
No, that's very right. I think, David Hill and Web of Comrade, they are going to be speaking tomorrow. You don't want to miss that session at Veeam Live, so I'll put that plug in for them. But, before we announced the acquisition, we had already announced a strategic partnership, way before that. So we have been working together, and I think super excited about that. So I think it's been fantastic, and there's so much more to be done as we go forward. But yeah, I don't want to steal the thunder either. But so we'll wait. I'll punt it for another 24 hours. But good stuff happening.
Jason, maybe just a little bit we can talk about. We can bring up a graphic that shows the two ecosystems.
Yeah, the thing to remember about this relationship, and I, like the other two, we can't spoil tomorrow's news, as cool as that would be. But you got to remember that we have had this strategic alliance partnership for a while, right? And those alliance partnerships are never based just on, hey, we're going to meet in the channel. Right? That is always based on better together as a concept. But because we can't talk about that, let's at least talk about better side by side, which is the chart that you see here. And I guess the thing that I would point out to folks is when you think about how the Veeam platform on the right-hand side has evolved, just like everything we talked about before, it always starts with backup. It always starts with you got to solve backup or everything else becomes aspirational at that point, right? And so certainly we started with just VMs, but if you look on the top of the right-hand side on the Veeam stack, you'll see that over time, we've added cloud workloads on IaaS, we've added SaaS, we've added physical servers, we've added the kinds of applications and workloads that our control plane that is Veeam Backup is able to address. Now, in order to make sure that we are accessible across the broadest possible amount of data center and cloud type architectures, look on the bottom of that slide, and we work with almost every major storage layer that's out there and every cloud layer that's out there, right? So it's always about common control plane, value add capabilities like orchestration and monitoring on top of that, and then what are the apps that matter on top? What are the storage layers underneath that you have to interact with in order to provide that comprehensive delivery? And golly, that looks awfully similar on the left-hand side of that screen, right? So in this case, Kubernetes is that common control plane in the middle, and then the orchestration, of course, that K10 provides. And then, hey, look, you got some apps on the top, you got some storage on the bottom. There are so many reasons why this partnership has always made sense from a culture, from a vision, from an architecture. The list just goes on and on. This was a marriage made in heaven. Gaurav, if you want to unpack that left side really quick for us.
Sure, and I'm conscious of the time, but I'm so passionate about this ecosystem growing. But I think very quickly, like you put it out, at the bottommost layer, your data needs to reside at the end of the day somewhere. And so you definitely have the storage layer. There are varieties of them. There's block, there's file, there's object. It could be on premises or it could be in public clouds. We support all of these options. We have direct integrations, and then we support integrations even through what is called the container storage interface, which is CSI in parlance of Kubernetes, to support an even bigger growing list of companies out there. So that, first of all, gives you that freedom of choice at that layer. The Kubernetes distribution, there are a few of those too. Amazon has EKS, there is AWS, there is AKS from the Microsoft folks. There's OpenShift from the Red Hat folks. We support all of those. And of course, we support Tanzu, which we talked about in the context of VMworld. So again, you have freedom of choice in the context of the Kubernetes distributions that you decide to use. In terms of the data services, like I talked about, you want to have your applications backed up, and different applications might require different levels of consistency and granularity of both backup and recoverability. Some might be okay to be backed up and recovered at the layer of storage, but some might require you to have the transaction level granularity. So what we've also done is created blueprints and integrated with a variety of logical dumps to enable logical dumps at the databases. So Postgres and MongoDBs and so on. And this list actually continues to grow. And so we also have a bunch of integrations even at that layer. So K10 ends up integrating with all of these three broad layers, if you will, and that's more or less mirrors what you've always had in the VM world. And this breadth of choice, I think at the end of the day, gives you that freedom of choice from a customer's perspective.
Awesome. Well, Gaurav, thank you so much for visiting with Jason and myself. We do want to give a quick shout out. I think we had 19 different countries with multiple states in the U.S. Participate today. So thank you for that live quick view of the map. Also want to give a quick commercial while we wrap up. We've mentioned it a couple times, but we will have our Veeam live event tomorrow in the Americas Theater, October 20th, tomorrow. We've got a couple other things coming up Friday. This coming Friday, Rick Vanover will recap Veeam Live. And then a week from today, Jason and I will be with Michael Cade from the Veeam Product Strategy Group, talking about NetApp Insight and the things going on between those two companies. On behalf of Jason, thank you so much, Gaurav. Everyone, thank you for tuning in. Stay safe, stay positive, and we'll see you on the next live stream.
Thank you. All right. Stay safe.